through the East Hampton Library virtually. We're extremely happy to have Ranger Pat Ryley back with us, who has been fantastic in putting these PowerPoints together of the wonderful things in our Long Island waters, in our parks. We had a ranger last month did a wonderful talk on sharks, which is on YouTube. And we have this one tonight, the salt marsh at Fire Island. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ranger Pat Ryley.
Thank you, Steve. So welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. The salt marsh is one of several ecosystems on Fire Island, but we're all familiar with it because the South Shore of Long Island is also got a lot of salt marsh. And it's not one of the sexy ecosystems like the sunken forest. Salt marsh is everywhere, but it's so important. It's such an important ecosystem, and I'm glad you guys are here to learn about it. So Fire Island is a barrier island just south of Long Island. So here's a map. This is our brochure map. I hope you can see it okay. And the South Shore of Long Island is there at the top of the map. Fire Island at the west. So if we start at the left side of the photo, we can see the Fire Island Lighthouse adjacent to Robert Moses State Park. And then we have some sort of green and white areas. Then there's the Otis Pike Wilderness. And then at the far right of your photo, or of the map, is the Smith Point Bridge to our Wilderness Visitor Center. So one of the interesting things about Fire Island is that there are 17 private communities embedded within the federal lands. And we have a very special area, 7 miles of wilderness on the eastern area as well. So we're gonna sort of go to Watch Hill, because even though there's salt marshes all along, and we see salt marshes on the South Shore of Long Island, we have a great nature trail at Watch Hill. Watch Hill is reached by ferry from Patchogue. So the photo background I'm using now is a view from an overlook on our nature trail over the salt marsh. So let's take a look at Watch Hill to start with. Now, this map is going to be really confusing because the lower left, you see the arrow pointing north. I don't know why they made this map with south on top, but doesn't matter. If you orient yourself, the beach is at the top, and that would be the ocean. And this nature trail loop is sort of center left. So if you were to visit Watch Hill, it's right adjacent to the marina, and there's salt marsh really everywhere on Fire Island. So, okay, so here is our salt marsh nature trail. At first glance, it looks like a lot of grass. Okay, salt marsh is a lot of grass, but it is a very highly productive ecosystem. It probably rivals, for the amount of carbon produced here, rivals intensely cultivated agriculture. And a couple of factors that contribute to this is nutrient enrichment from watershed runoff and tidal mixing. The vegetation, these grasses have extensive root system that enable them to withstand storm surges and buffer storm impacts. So the salt marsh is really important to the resilience of our shoreline. And imagine a great way to understand how this helps protect us from a storm surge. If you drop a glass of water on a hard floor, it'll run everywhere. But if you think of dropping a glass of water on a carpet, it soaks in and doesn't run nearly as far along the floor. And that's what the salt marsh does. It helps absorb the energy of the water. It also provides food and safety for a lot of wildlife. It is a nursery ground for fish, for small shrimp, crabs. And then because all these juvenile animals are thriving in the salt marsh, we also have shorebirds and other wildlife that use this as a food source. So it's part of our Atlantic flyway. We have at this time of year a lot of migratory birds that you might not see anywhere else or anytime. And it filters pollutants as well. The salt marsh is really important. And we're going to look at some of our other ecosystems just to see how it fits in. So here is a typical cross section of sort of a wider part of Fire Island, where the ocean is on the left in this image. We see the beach, primary dune. Our naming should help understand this is the first dune that takes the brunt of the ocean's energy. There's a secondary dune, which is much older, and it's been there long enough to accumulate soil from the decaying vegetation and grow a little more advanced plant life. In between the two dunes, we have a swale area, and that's sort of that hot, dry, where most of the boardwalks are when you walk along Fire Island, with very low-lying plants which are heat resistant, and they can conserve water very well. So the forest exists in places like our sunken forest opposite Sayville, where the island is wide enough to have a forest that doesn't really grow much higher than that secondary dune. And then the salt marsh is closest to the bay. And the figures at the bottom tell us we have 40% wetlands. So 40% of the land mass of Fire Island is salt marsh. Tidal creeks help exchange nutrients between the marsh and the bay. And again, it's a buffer against tidal and storm surges. So these grasses, let's look a little more closely at the plants that we're going to find in the salt marsh. So yes, it looks like a lot of grass. These are two different ones. We're going to name them in just a minute. But one of the important features is they can tolerate tidal flooding. So salt marshes, typically the tides are twice a day. High tide will inundate. It won't put the entire grass underwater, but the roots and the lower part of the plant is definitely in the salt water at high tide. And at a moon tide, it can be totally underwater and covered in water. And not every plant can tolerate this. If you were around for Hurricane Sandy, the flooding, or any other coastal flooding, my lawn died because of the salt water. A lot of plants can't take it. But these, especially the spartinas. So we have smooth cordgrass and salt meadow hay, and we'll look at them. You'll be able to see the names of them. Grow in the intertidal zone. The salt meadow hay on the right is a little bit higher, slightly higher elevation. And they both form a mat, which helps, holds our beach together. And the decaying vegetation forms a bog with lots and lots of nutrients, and carbon is sequestered here. It's a lot of energy from the sun is stored in these plants. So a little closer look. The smooth cordgrass is more abundant. You see this everywhere. It looks very similar to beach grass, the length of it, the color of it. But because of the salt water, it's really kind of interesting. If you were to pick a piece and run your fingers up the blade, you'd find crystals of salt. So it does get rid of the salt from the water through the surface of the leaves. It dies back in the fall, and the decaying plant matter, the blades and the roots, collect organic sediment, and it actually raises the elevation of the island. So everything's a contrast with sea level rise at this point. And the elevation, actually, we are adding height to the salt marsh by the decaying vegetation, as well as sand that blows over the dunes. So the other grass is this salt meadow hay, or Spartina patens. And it was easier to see in the first picture. I'll go back to that. It makes these sort of cowlicks. It flattens down. It looks like waves. It's really quite beautiful. And it grows best at a slightly higher elevation than the cordgrass. But the cordgrass has now contributed to that higher elevation. So we might see areas that used to be cordgrass, if they're a little bit elevated, salt meadow hay will move in. We have another plant that grows in the salt marsh. It's also very salt tolerant, and glasswort is the common name. You may have heard of sea beans. It's also called sea beans because these are quite edible, these stems. They don't have leaves per se, but it's almost like a succulent. And the common name came into use in the 16th century to describe plants that grew in England that could be burned, and the ashes could be used to make soda-based glass. So the ash, these salts contained in the ash, when this plant is burned, were used in glass making. And in the fall, if you've ever been to the salt marsh, it turns a beautiful shade of pinkish red. It's really quite pretty. So these are the main plants. When we'll talk about plants that we see at slightly higher elevations. But the salt marsh itself, on Long Island, as well as Fire Island, you may have seen these mosquito ditches, as they're called. So the photo on the left shows a couple of men digging, and then a whole load of guys moving pretty much mud out of the area. So 90% of the salt marshes on the Atlantic coast had been grid ditched. And we'll look at an aerial photo in just a minute to see how extensive it is. And this is just a small photo. If you look at Long Island in general, if you live anywhere near the water, near a salt marsh, these are everywhere. So in the 1930s, before pesticides came into use to control mosquitoes, I believe I read there was one case of maybe malaria in New York, and they decided, oh, we have to control the mosquitoes. So they began to ditch the salt marshes in the 1930s. And this was done by the Civilian Conservation Corps under President Roosevelt Franklin's New Deal. So a lot of this was make work. There were men out of work, they needed to put them to work, and they sent them to hand dig thousands of miles of these ditches. They're all 100 to 150 feet apart. The idea of this was to drain the water out of the marsh. Well, clearly this didn't work because they're tidal and the tide fills them. So here's an aerial photo of the Watch Hill Marina, and that's our nature trail. You can see sort of in the center left, but you can, if you notice these parallel lines there, so they mostly were parallel north-south with some horizontal ditches to connect them. And this is just, imagine this is maybe a half mile of the beach. These continued over all of Fire Island. any old map or current aerial photo, you'll see these. And some places like the Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge have started to fill them, actually, to help the salt marsh heal, because this continued until the 1960s. It was not found to be very effective in controlling mosquitoes. And then the scientists started to realize that these had a really negative effect on the salt marsh ecosystem. So a figure that I found in online well, it's a published paper, 15 million feet or 2,841 miles of mosquito ditches were dug in Suffolk County alone. So imagine that, almost 3,000 miles of mosquito ditches all over Suffolk County. And that was just, you know, a small part of the whole project, went over the whole East Coast. Unfortunately, these altered the natural processes of water moving, and they actually sped up the degradation and the die-off of the wetlands. So this was not a good idea. Many of the non-tidal pools, which provide habitat, were destroyed. And the plant communities were really interrupted. We're digging up a lot of this ecosystem, affecting the sea life and the bird populations. So here is what these ditches look like today at ground level. This is Watch Hill, and they're healing. They were probably dug to about 5 feet in width at one point. So the photo here, it's maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. So they're, as the grass grows and decays, that bog is starting to fill in. The edges are creeping closer. So that's a good thing. And in this photo, this is a good one to show some of the other plants adjacent to the salt marsh. So the grasses are the ones that get inundated by the tides every day. A little bit higher ground, we'll see Phragmites, which are common reeds. They grow everywhere on Long Island near the water, and some other shrubs. Once we get a little bit higher elevation, where the salt water doesn't soak the roots every day, we get some different kinds of plants in the salt marsh. So Phragmites is this one on the left. I'm sure you've seen it. It has these sort of feathery tops to it. And they are very, very well adapted because they can grow in salt water and brackish water and also in fresh water. So if you know what cattails are, and I'm not sure, I have a picture here of cattails. Cattails are another giant reed or giant grass, and they have the seed head at the top. It looks like a brown cigar. So cattails grow only in fresh water. So because the Phragmites is so adaptable, it tends to squeeze out the cattails, but it also does a very good job, the roots, of holding the land together, holding the sand together. We have to remember that the South Shore of Long Island and Fire Island especially are really built of sand, and the vegetation is what keeps it all together. Okay, Marsh Elder is another plant. It's also called high tide bush, just because it grows right at the edge of where the high tide would reach. And so it's not as salt tolerant as some of our other plants. Okay, before I continue, I just want to hit you up for any questions. Do we have any questions so far? I'm not sure if I can see a show of hands. Do we have any? Has anyone been to Watch Hill? I see at least one raised hand. Okay, I can't see everybody. Oh wait, maybe I can. Let me fool around.
Hi, yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
I used to live in Queens and now I live in Nassau. And I was just along the Cross Island a day or two ago, and I saw either Phragmites or cattails. And if you go all along the Cross Island, all the way north, all the way to the bridges, you see this stuff growing all along the whole side of the Cross Island. So I assume that's the same exact stuff that you're seeing in the salt. Are those salt marshes too?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. You know, the entire JFK airport
Yes.
is built on the salt marsh.
So
they added fill so they could pave it, but that's a huge salt marsh up there.
So it's all Phragmites and cattails, is that it?
Yes, the tall ones, and let me just skip back. So anything that looks tall with these feathery tops is Phragmites.
Okay.
The cattails have a sort of a solid brown,
Cigar, yeah, like a cigar.
like a cigar at the top. Yeah.
Okay.
And that helps us know that there's fresh water in that spot, because they won't grow in brackish water. They grow in freshwater ponds.
So the cattails grow also in freshwater, or they're mixed, or
Yeah, yeah. So I'm sorry. Let me make myself clear. The Phragmites grow in brackish, which is salty water, or freshwater, while the cattails grow only in freshwater. They don't do well in brackish or salty water.
Okay. So, but you have all of them along the Cross
You
Island.
have all of them. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have both kinds of water then.
Yes, exactly. So there must be some kind of streams or ponds. What happened when they dug these salt marshes, they dug these mosquito ditches through the salt marsh, was that they now connected all the freshwater ponds to the bay, to the Great South Bay. So they, in essence, reduced the amount of freshwater habitat.
Did they do that in Queens also? Or
Yes, they did it everywhere.
Okay, got it.
They did it everywhere. That was a great question, though.
Yeah. Well, I just saw it the other day. I said, gosh, it's already 6 feet tall or 8 feet tall, and the season just beginning. Is that last year's stuff or new stuff that's
the new stuff is already coming up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It kind of turns brown. Okay, question: how deep were those ditches? I have to admit, I have fallen into a few of them, and they're probably about 3 feet deep.
Now,
well, they're I'd say 2 feet of water and a foot of mud, because they're filling in with silt or mud. So slowly they're closing up, which is a good thing.
okay. All right, thank you. It's just something I saw yesterday, you know.
Okay, yeah, no, great. That's great.
Yeah.
And Phragmites especially like disturbed ground. So we see them around sumps, anywhere near water, near the bay, or near even ponds or streams. Phragmites grows, and it's nearly impossible to stop it. I've seen it grow right up through asphalt. So it's not a bad thing. It's a plant. Okay, it's good. It's holding the ground together. It's photosynthesizing, but it spreads really easily. And an interesting fact about the Phragmites we have on Long Island, it's not native. Now, how long does a plant have to be here until we consider it native and not invasive? It was actually imported from Europe, and people brought it in as a decorative grass, and it has spread everywhere because it really likes Long Island. One of the reasons Fire Island, we discourage even private homeowners from planting non-native grasses, is how quickly they spread. And we see it. We see very interesting, you can buy a lot of interesting grasses at garden shops, and those feathery seed heads just blow and grow everywhere. Groundsel tree, which is the other photo I have on the screen now, is as a shrub that you can actually buy at some nurseries and grow. It's very, very hardy. It's salt tolerant, and it has these beautiful white flowers in the fall. So I'm gonna figure out how to move on. Okay, so salt marsh services. What does the salt marsh do for us? Well, here's just kind of a summary. It acts as a filter. It helps filter pollutants. It catches them in the roots. Those same roots and network of decayed plant matter, and it's a very dense root mass, acts as a sediment trap. This means as soil washes from higher ground out, it catches it. So it doesn't just go into the bay, but it actually adds nutrients at the point where it's trapped. It's a nursery ground for these fish, crabs, shrimp, and a food source, not just the plants themselves, but all those juvenile fish, crabs, shrimp become a food source for our migrating birds and other shore birds. We have researchers out in our salt marsh all the time. So if you visit Fire Island, and you especially Watch Hill, these are some of the studies that are going on in Watch Hill, they are studying soil elevation and how it is changing in relation to sea level rise. Right now, sea level is winning. So our salt marsh is not gaining elevation as fast as the actual sea level is rising. They also study, you can see they study the plants themselves. They can determine the age or when the salt marsh was born by taking these samples. It's pretty interesting. It's protected. So we don't encourage your everyday person to go marching through it. We have boardwalk nature trails. And apart from being very muddy, sticky place to walk, you can see the scientist on the right is standing on a board. This is a great place for ticks. So we recommend staying on the boardwalk. We see a lot of shorebirds out here. Here are two very common ones on the left. That's an egret. Long Island is home to two different kinds of egret, the great egret and the snowy egret. So in a photo like this, where it's from a distance, it's really hard to tell because the great egret is bigger. The snowy egret, as well as being smaller, if it takes off and you see it fly, its feet are bright yellow. So the great egret, its legs are black. You can kind of see it in the photo. The legs are black and the feet are black. But the snowy is very, very different because it's got the bright yellow feet. We see these on Long Island as well. And their long legs help them stand on the marsh, and they have a long bill as well for reaching between the grass to feed. We also have great blue herons. So those are not as common as the egrets, but the similar build, tall, long beak, designed for feeding in the salt marsh. The bird on the right is a willet, and these are migratory. They do fly south for the winter, but they come back in the summer and nest on Fire Island. And we have them at Watch Hill nesting. They're not quite as impressive as the big white egret would be. They're a little better camouflaged, but again, the long legs, the long beak tell me that they're built and they're very well adapted to living and feeding in the salt marsh. Some of our other salt marsh birds, the RedWinged Blackbird, you may have started to hear them this spring. Their song is sort of like a buzz. They're insect eaters. And when you see these black birds with the red epaulets or shoulder patches, these are males. The females are just drab brown. The female might look like a large sparrow. So you could totally see a female red-winged blackbird and miss it and not know what it is. But the males are very, very common over the salt marsh. On the right-hand side, we see an eastern kingbird. I've never seen them anywhere but in the salt marsh at Watch Hill. They look like just a dark bird, but as you can see in the photo, the edge of the tail has got these white, it's got a white band, and they're very territorial. So if you walk anywhere near their territory, they may fly up and sort of screech at you. Another one here, this is a different bird. This is, my photo is not the greatest. If you can see that bird in this, the middle bird, you might be able to see that the beak is kind of downturned. And a lot of times we see a downturned beak, we think, oh, that's a tropical bird. And they are a part of a family that are usually in more tropical areas. So this is a Glossy Ibis. Ibis, they come in different subspecies, or I guess species, but the ibis also feeds in the salt marsh and will roost together with the egrets and the herons in the trees. So at night, you might find these all at dusk, sort of lined up in the trees where they roost. These are Ruddy Turnstone. Again, they're probably more colorful than a lot of the other sort of sandpiper-like birds we see on Fire Island and on Long Island. They don't look quite so colorful most of the year. So this would be probably in June and July. They have their special breeding colors, so they look fairly reddish with brown. And the name sort of gives it away. Ruddy for the red color, turnstone. They do walk along and turn over stones and look for small creatures, whether it's immature crabs and shrimp, or isopods, which would be the marine equivalent of an insect. So we find these on the salt marsh, as well as, I mean, lots of other birds. It's hard to cover all of them. I hope you can all come to Watch Hill, come on a nature walk, and have a ranger sort of point some of these out. Over the marsh, we also have these predators. We really like them because they eat mosquitoes. The barn swallows, which are the swallows on the left, you may see them on Long Island. They live under the boardwalks. They are known for nesting in barns. We have tree swallows as well. They're very similar. So we see these sort of zipping over the salt marsh, flying in these kind of erratic patterns, because what they're doing is catching mosquitoes on the fly. So as they fly along, they catch mosquitoes. You know, you can recognize swallows because they have a forked tail. And some people who live near the salt marsh here on Long Island, near where I live, put up special houses for purple martins. And purple martins are another very similar species to swallows. They're a little bit bigger, and they're sort of all one dark purple, almost black color. They have the forked tail, which really helps them fly fast and maneuver. So they're very maneuverable birds. And what they do during the day is what the bats do at night. So if you've ever seen a bat flying, sort of erratic patterns, it's because they're flying along, going from mosquito to mosquito. Our dragonfly on the right is one of my favorites. I used to be afraid of them when I was a kid because I thought that was a big stinger. Well, they're harmless to humans. They are beautiful with their colors and wings. But their immature form is a very kind of odd shape. If you could imagine sort of the front half of this without the wings, swimming in the water. So their nymphs are also predators. So you may know that mosquitoes breed in the water. They lay their eggs in the water. The immature form, which is called a nymph, lives in the water. This is why everyone tells us, make sure you don't leave standing water outside, empty out the dog bowl every day, make sure you don't have puddles in your yard because mosquitoes breed there. And you may have even seen mosquito larvae. They're about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch long, black little weird things in the water. So the nymph of the dragonfly eats the mosquito nymphs. And then when they emerge and become adults, the adults eat adult mosquitoes. So we really like dragonflies. And this is one of the reasons pesticides are probably not the best choice for killing mosquitoes in the salt marsh, because mosquitoes, their life cycle is very short, in just a few days, from egg to nymph to adult. And a spray might kill a generation of them, but dragonflies have a much longer life cycle. Some are months or even years in their nymph stage. So if a pesticide kills all the adult everything, the mosquitoes will be back in a few days, while the dragonflies might take months to come back. So that's very controversial. We all love to hate mosquitoes, but we should really like our dragonflies and try to help protect them. We have some interesting turtles in our salt marsh as well. And they're not, I can't say they're common. We see them rarely because they sort of stay out of sight. On the left is a snapping turtle. So snapping turtles can range from 8 inches to about 20 inches long, their shell. So that's almost 2 feet long, and they can weigh about 35 pounds. Snapping turtles are dark colored. They stay in the mud, so we don't see them very often. On the right is a diamondback terrapin, and these are protected. They have become very, very rare. They are about, a female would be about 9 inches long at the most. A male would be about 5.5 inches long, for, its shell. And these live also in the salt marsh in the mud, and they were hunted nearly to extinction for turtle soup. Now, I don't think anybody nowadays eats turtle soup, but apparently a few hundred years ago in colonial times, it was something to eat. So we're very happy when we see our diamondback terrapins because they're not common at all. Both of these types of turtles come on land to lay their eggs. They have very strong digging, their back legs, their hind legs scoop out the dirt, and then they back into the hole they dig in order to lay their eggs. A little interesting fact about turtle eggs, which I learned a few years ago, is that the temperature that they are incubated at determines the sex of the turtle. So the eggs that are deeper, buried deeper, it's a little cooler, and they usually develop into male turtles. While the turtles that are closer to the eggs that are closer to the surface, I mean, they're all buried under the ground. The ones that are a little closer to the surface might get a little more heat from the sun. So a little couple of degrees warmer, they develop into females. So that's kind of interesting. So I see a question in the chat. Oh, somebody remembers having turtle soup. I wonder what it tasted like. So, questions? We're pretty much done. I'm happy to say we probably have 10 or 15 minutes if we had questions. I'd love to hear, Sue, you tell me about turtle soup. Not very tasty. Okay.
Feel free to unmute or type any questions in the chat.
Either way, if people want to unmute, that might be easier.
I just put in a question. Do all turtles change sex by depth of sand, or is that just the terrapins that you saw?
It's also true for sea turtles. So it might not be all turtles, but it happens to be true for the terrapins, the snapping turtles, and many sea turtles.
Okay. Also, I wanted to ask you, you said that the Phragmites were not native. What about the cattails? Were those native?
Native, yes. Cattails are native.
Would they get overthrown by the Phragmites?
They are outcompeted.
Yeah, outcompeted. Okay.
The Phragmites, if you remember those sort of feathery tops.
Yes, yes.
Those are all seeds, and they're very light. They float around. Now, the cattails also have seeds that float like that, but if they land in brackish water, they won't grow. They need fresh water.
Oh, I have sea oats. Sea oats are very pretty. Do they grow in the brackish water or fresh water?
That I'm not sure of.
They're really pretty. They look like, like wheat or oats when they're growing. You know, because I have a wet spot. So I'm looking, what can I plant in my wet spot?
Right.
Yes,
Right.
they said sea oats. I said, oh, I have those somewhere else.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
You're welcome.
Thank you for sharing all this information with us.
You're welcome. Do I have any other questions?
Yeah, how about
I have a quick question. And I don't know if you would know the answer to it because it's about JFK. And I guess I didn't ever realize that they put fill and completely covered up the salt marsh. But do you know what kind of effects that had on the surrounding waterways and the birds and the wildlife in that area? Because it's huge.
Yes. It had pretty disastrous effects. Very recently, they wanted to add runways, and it was declined. They would not let them.
Wow.
There's an article from last weekend or the weekend before in the New York Times about the Jamaica Bay. There's a wildlife refuge there. It's part of our Gateway National Recreation Area. And it talks a lot about what they've done to help bring it back to life, because that airport really did not good things for the salt marshes there. There were a lot of sort of all the South Shore, all the way into New York City was salt marsh at one time. And they wanted to use it for housing, so they put fill in.
Wow. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing they got away with that.
Well, even when they dug these mosquito ditches, they didn't understand all the consequences. The same thing with pesticides. When those mosquito ditches didn't work for draining the marsh to prevent the mosquitoes from breeding, they poured DDT in them, which just killed everything. It's more recently, environmentalists have gotten involved. Somebody mentioned, sherry in the turtle soup. That's good. And sea lavender. Okay, and that's a plant I'm not familiar with. Is that native? Do we know?
I don't know. We have it growing near Ligony Creek in Sag Harbor.
Okay.
It's little tiny lavender flowers in the tidal area.
Okay.
It's very pretty, and as I say, it dries up wonderfully well if you want to keep it.
Very nice. I'm not familiar with it. I confess that I'm pretty good with everything we find on Fire Island, but beyond that, I'm not an expert.
Well, as I say, we call it sea lavender. Who knows what it really is?
Right, okay. Right. I'd be interested though. I bet I could look that up. Yeah.
I have a question. It seems like at least over the last 10 years, the amount of osprey around the waterways feeding has, exponentially increased. Do you have ideas on why that is?
Yes. So this is fascinating to me because it is a direct result of the ban on DDT.
Wow.
So in the 1960s, it was environmentalists started to say DDT is bad. They noticed plants and animals and insects and birds dying. And it probably took about a decade until the 70s for them to realize that the DDT, it's a pesticide. It's not used anymore, which is good. But think of the food chain. Let's say a very small fish eats 100 mosquitoes. So that's the concentration of pesticide from 100 mosquitoes. A bigger fish eats 100 little fish. So where are we now? 100 times 100, 10,000. Now, an even bigger fish eats in its lifetime 100 of those medium-sized fish. It grows exponentially. And then the osprey is an apex predator. He eats the big fish. The concentration of DDT in the bigger fish was so great that it caused the eggshells of osprey and eagles not to form. The eggshells were not strong enough to support the bird sitting on it. So the eggs didn't hatch. They basically broke. Or the bird would sit on the egg and it never hatched. And it's because if you just get out your calculator, do the math, 100 mosquitoes eaten by each little fish. And that's, they probably eat more than 100 in their lifetime. And then the next biggest fish has that concentration of whatever that amount of DDT was in the mosquitoes multiplied by 100, multiplied by another 100, up to the bald eagles and the osprey. They couldn't reproduce. And it took them about a decade to figure it out. And if you're familiar, a Long Islander from Brookhaven named Dennis Pouliston went to Albany and presented the data, which eventually led to the ban on DDT.
Wow, great.
So, yeah. And osprey they really have made a huge comeback. They're everywhere now. And bald eagles too are starting to come back. I don't know what the population was pre-DDT, before they started using all the pesticides. But I know that bald eagles were put on the endangered species list and they were removed, I want to say in the 1990s. I don't remember the exact year. But they were on the endangered species list for quite a while. Osprey, I don't know what their status was, whether they were ever considered endangered or not, but there were definitely very, very small numbers. And they've made a great, eagles and lead poisoning. Yeah. So do you know where they're getting the lead from? When hunters go out into the marsh and shoot shotgun shells, all the pellets used to be lead. Now they're stainless steel, but the pellets, all these shotgun pellets were falling into the marsh from the duck hunters. No one really knew any better. And again, eagles eat fish. So whatever creatures were eating the lead, or the lead probably leached from the pellets into the water, the eagles were getting lead poisoning from it was from lead shot from shotgun shells.
Now the fish are eating plastic. The fish are eating plastic.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
people
it's
really
everywhere.
have to stop littering. It's killing the wildlife. And in Florida, everything they did there with the Everglades was wrong. They pulled out all the mangroves and that kept the state together, and then they flooded worse. Everything they thought was good is bad.
Right. people tried a lot of things. I think that's what it was. It was an experiment, like the mosquito ditches. I don't know where they got their data saying that would help. Somebody just thought, oh, that might be a good idea. And they built thousands of miles of these mosquito ditches and like, oops, the high tide comes and fills them up every day, twice a day. That didn't work. I don't know what kind of thought process went into some of these plans.
Even the street trees, the calorie pear that they put in the street trees, they're terrible. And then they have to cut them in the middle because the power lines run through, and then the trees look like a Y. And you know, which I actually heard one of the guys from, you know, the plant department saying he made a mistake. It shouldn't have been the pear trees, but they're there. There are thousands of them there, and they're all
Right.
terrible. You know, so the people who are making these decisions don't know what they're doing.
Right. Or they don't study it enough. They don't study it enough to find out or they don't know what the results are until they make that mistake.
Exactly.
So,
There are implications that they can't predict.
yeah.
Oh, well, let's all try to be good citizens. And not
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's very
Oh, you're welcome. Do we have any more questions?
Very interesting.
talk about native plants. Which are native plants? You told me the cattails are native.
Right. On Fire Island, I mean, any of those groundsel trees, those people can buy those
How
at,
tall
you
do
know,
they
at a
grow?
nursery.
How tall do they grow?
Maybe 4 feet tall. They're shrubs and they're green all summer. And then in the fall, they have the white flowers
And then they lose the leaves?
and they lose their leaves. Yep.
All right. But that, anything else native that, you know, we should
Oh,
know about?
boy. It's not my area of expertise.
Okay, I'm sorry to ask you.
No, it's okay. It's something you could look up, though. I bet your library could help you with that.
Yeah, you just Google everything. Everything's in the Google.
That's true.
Okay, thanks again. Okay.
You're welcome. So,
Well, I'd like to thank you, Ranger Pat, for this wonderful presentation, as always. And I'd like to thank everyone for zooming in. And stay tuned because there's more good stuff to come as we get into the summer season. And anyone who's interested in plants and parks, on April 26th is Frederick Olmsted's birthday, 200 years old. So we will be having an Olmsted celebration, which will be over Zoom as well as in person. It will be a hybrid in the afternoon at 2 o'clock. And that's in conjunction with the Cornell Cooperative Extension. So Cornell Cooperative is a wonderful entity for answering any questions regarding plants, shrubs, and seeds. And that is coming April 26th. And once again, I'd like to thank Ranger Ryley, and we'll see you again.
thanks for having me. I hope to see everybody over on Fire Island this summer.
Will do. Will do. Thank
Have
you.
a nice evening. Bye-bye, everybody.
Same to you. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.